Díomh agus fáilte romh a cairde is mise Oisin le sciol agus as mór orm on session seo oscailte inniu. Just while we're waiting for our third speaker, I'd like to take a moment to thank Dublin City Council, the Department of Tourism, Culture, Arts, Gaeltacht, Sport and the Media, and the Decade of Centenaries Expert Advisory Committee for their generous support of this conference. I would also personally like to extend my thanks to Francie Devine for inviting me to participate, and in a general note, extend my congratulations to all at the ILHS for the success of this historic conference. I think it really has been a fantastic weekend, and congratulations to all involved. Now, we are quite tight for time, so I'm going to fire ahead with the introductions of our three speakers. We'll then go through the speeches and hopefully finish in time for you to get your lunch. Now, our first speaker today is going to be Helena Sheehan. Helena is an emeritus professor with the School of Communications in DCU, where she has published prolifically on everything from the rise of Syriza to the evolution of Irish public broadcasting, certainly a hot-button issue today. A major figure on the Irish left as both an academic and an activist, she played a major role in the Occupy movement and the wider campaign against austerity, and continues to campaign on diverse issues, including but not limited to the defence of Irish neutrality. This is all to say that she is one of the most prolific and diverse thinkers on the left in Ireland today. I'm sure her contributions will be fascinating and enlightening. Second, we will have Dr. Bernd Buehlbaecher. Dr. Buehlbaecher is a graduate from the University of Duisburg in Essen, who previously studied at Trinity College as well as in Moscow for a time. Following a long career as a history teacher, he is now an academic councillor at the Bayerische University of Wuppertal. And today he will be speaking on the development of Marxist theory among European intellectuals during the interwar period. Now finally, conveniently for me and for our timing, our third speaker really requires no introduction. Suffice to say that as General Secretary of the Communist Party of Ireland for over 20 years, Eugene McCartan led that party through a historic period for the movement and played a major role in countless campaigns and organisations. Aside from that, he was a major figure in the establishment of the Peadar O'Donnell Forum and continues to write and publish on history and social justice issues. I think it would be fair to say there are likely few people with more thoroughly versed in the history of socialism on the left in Ireland, and I'm very sure we're all very excited to hear his contribution today. Thank you very much. I'll now hand over to Professor Sheehan.
So, I want to address the question of what does Marxism specifically bring to a conference on visions of class, visions of labor and class. For me, this is connected to what Marxism brings to everything: context, clarity, coherence, comprehensiveness. Marxism is an intellectual tradition connected to a political movement that focuses on totality, on how everything is connected to everything else. It is a theory of everything, one that is open-ended and always evolving. There are certain tenets that are basic, as well as many matters where there are serious differences and lively debates. It is a philosophy of economics, politics, history, culture, even psychology, that sees all of these spheres as decisively shaped by the dominant mode of production. It is in particular a critique of the capitalist mode of production and an orientation to socialism as an alternative mode of production. Class is a key concept for Marxism. The word has many uses as a term of differentiation and stratification. In social, political, economic terms, it is a way of categorizing social groups in terms of wealth, status, education, occupation, culture, often in a very loose and somewhat shoddy way, when it is addressed at all. For Marxism, it is a more precise concept and one that is central to its whole analysis of society. So, what is class for Marxism? The bourgeoisie and proletariat. That is those who own the means of production, and those who depend on wage labor to live. Within these classes, there are various strata and other differences, but the great divide is between those who do the work of the world and those who appropriate the fruits of their work, those who can extract the surplus value of labor without necessarily laboring. I'm assuming here a broad definition of who is the working class, including not only the prototypical proletarian, a male manual worker, but all who work by hand and brain, those who make the world as we know it happen, those who live by their labor, whether plumbers or pilots or professors, whether they build houses, stack shelves, perform surgery, or pursue scientific research, of all genders, races, ethnicities, and nations, the many who are manipulated into serving the interests of the few. There is a near absence of discourse about class in contemporary society. This is because capitalism functions as a system in such a way as to mask the nature of itself as a system. There is a liberal discourse about diversity, inclusion, fairness, helping those in need, that actually conceals the realities of class. Whenever issues of social distribution are discussed, there is always lip service paid to given to protecting those who are most vulnerable, often reducing the working class to those who need rather than those who do, those who take rather than those who give. The trade union movement is nearly alone in addressing the real relationship between production and distribution, to argue that what people are demanding is what they have earned through their labor. Even then, it is a matter more often of making the case in terms of specific disputes and what is being demanded in terms of wages and conditions for specific groups of workers. We rarely hear trade union officials speak about the working class as a class, making demands for radical distribution in terms of their overall role in social production. However, look at the massive response to Mick Lynch when he's been in the media spotlight and spoken not only about railway workers, but about the working class without whom the lights aren't turned on, the trains don't run, the streets aren't swept, the sick aren't nursed, the students aren't taught. The clarity and the simplicity of that has resonated powerfully. We were here a few months ago celebrating Robert Tressel's great novel, The Ragged-Trousered Philanthropists. The title itself stresses what the working class gives rather than what it takes. Then there is the great Bertolt Brecht poem, Questions from a Worker Who Reads. Who built Thebes of the Seven Gates? In the books, you will read the names of kings. Did the kings haul up the lumps of rock? And Babylon, many times demolished, who raised it up so many times? Great Rome is full of triumphal arches. Who erected them? Or there is that great anthem of the labor movement, Solidarity Forever. It is we who plowed the prairies, built the cities where they trade, dug the mines and built the workshops, endless miles of railway laid. Now we stand outcast and starving midst the wonders we have made. They have taken untold millions that they never toiled to earn, but without our brain and muscle, not a single wheel can turn. This needs to be constantly repeated for our times. The aim of socialism, animating the best of the labor movement, is a form of social organization according to the principle, from each according to their abilities, to each according to their needs. All that exists and is of value comes from nature or labor, or most often from a combination of both. Everyone who exists has the same number of hours in a day. Why should some people who spend some hours organizing production be able to accrue more in a few seconds than someone engaging in hard manual labor can earn in a year? Even worse, why should others who never in their whole lives do any work whatsoever but inherit shares or crowns be able to take enormous unearned wealth extracted from the labor of others? How did so much built by so many come to be expropriated by so few? It has not, on the whole, despite the rags to riches myths, come from genius invention or entrepreneurial skill. It has come largely by force, whether by marauding armies or through oligarchic manipulation of the state, passing and enforcing laws favorable to such expropriation. This is why the most conscious of the working class have organized for a system based on social ownership of the means of social production, allowing for a more just distribution and more efficient reinvestment, not only in the enterprise itself, but in the whole social infrastructure on which it depends. This is the only way to harness the resources of society in such a way to save our planet from the path of self-destruction on which we're hurtling along a trajectory that is inherent in the very logic of capitalism. To me, this is as clear as the rising sun, but the prevailing climate clouds over it, fills the space with clutter and noise, and diverts even progressive impulses into blind alleys. For example, the cultural turn, a shift in the analysis of social phenomenon in terms of culture and away from economics and science, away from class and mode of production, basically postmodernism as opposed to Marxism. I do not believe that the cultural turn was even good for the study of culture, whereas Marxism has always done that better by connecting it to the mode of production. Because I wrote 2 books on Irish television drama, and my editor said to me, class has nothing to do with this. And actually, I produced better books because I insisted that it did. So, another blind alley and related to that is identity politics. I understand the contemporary concern with identity. We live lives very different from those of our ancestors who lived in simpler times where identity was clearer, whereas we live in very complex times and identities have become much more complex and fluid and often confused. What began as a liberating attention to gender, race, and ethnicity has mutated into a displaced and disproportionate obsession with gender, race, and ethnicity at the expense of class. Of course, class is mentioned in discourses about intersectionality, but most often as the least important afterthought. There is valuable insight in intersectionality theory because class, race, gender, and ethnicity do intersect, but it is rarely elaborated in such a way as to conceptualize class as the core reality that it is. Class is often reduced to just another form of identity. In fact, I have heard it said that class is nothing more than straight, white, male, cis identity politics. Often, this kind of put-down masks an obsession with the micro-grievances of the relatively privileged at the expense of attention to the macro-exploitation of those at the lowest levels of the class pyramid. Actually, much of the real oppression associated with gender, race, and ethnicity takes the form of class exploitation. Look at who does actually occupy the lowest levels of the class pyramid. There is a way of talking about class without really talking about class. I hear voices on RTE, for example, talking about growing up in drug-infested working class communities, rising above addiction, turning to education as a lever of social mobility, and arguing that the working class are really just as good as anybody else, given the right help from good government policies. No, the working class are not just as good as anybody else. The working class make life as we live it possible. The working class makes the world go round. The working class should not be positioned as those in need of help for the most vulnerable, but as those who deserve just distribution of the fruits of their labor. This is why we need to engage in a discourse that provokes the working class to see themselves more clearly as the working class and to embark on a road that will lead from capitalism to socialism.
So thank you very much for the invitation, and of course congratulations to the Irish Labour History Society. I will deal with class and its distinctions in 20th century intellectual thinking, and this is such a broad topic that I break it down to one period, the 1930s, one case study of George Orwell. When I'm talking about that phenomena, it would be wise to reduce this complex matter to one intellectual figure of the interwar period, mainly to the early works of George Orwell, which are of course no classic historical primary sources, but short novels, reports, essays, so to speak, intellectual literary documents of the interwar period. My thesis might be challenging insofar that I'm looking for the early evidence or origin of new social categories and social analyses, which are usually applied to the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu since the late 1970s, which have possessed a strong impact on social, cultural history, and of course the social science since the last quarter of the 20th century. Of course, such an approach makes you intellectually vulnerable in many ways, but I hope it helps to understand the modification of Marxist theory along new categories, factors, and aspects of social analysis, which included the idea of different types of income, capital, the question of taste, a new understanding of up and downward social mobility, and the role of lifestyle in the late 1920s and especially in the 1930s. I would argue that all those ideas were present and accessible in the interwar period, and interestingly enough, forgotten after World War II. Before I give you some proof of my thesis in the early works of Orwell, it would be wise to call to mind some biographical information on this famous well-known author. George Orwell, pseudonym of Eric Arthur Blair, was born in 1903 in Motihari in Bengal, India, and died in 1950 in London. The father of this famous English novelist and essayist was a minor British official in the Indian Civil Service. His mother was the daughter of an unsuccessful teak merchant in Burma. Their attitudes were those of the landless gentry. In 1911, he returned to England with his parents and got sent to a preparatory boarding school in Sussex. From 1917 to 1921, he received a scholarship in Eton. In 1922, he became an assistant district superintendent in the Indian Imperial Police in Burma, instead of matriculating at a university. When he realized how much against the will the Burmese were ruled by the British, he felt increasingly ashamed of his role as a colonial police officer. In 1927, he decided not to return to Burma while on the leave to England, and in 1928, he resigned from the Imperial Police. The following years, he lived in the East End of London in cheap lodging houses among laborers and beggars. He spent a period in the slums of Paris and worked as a dishwasher in French hotels and restaurants. In 1936, Orwell was in Spain to report on the civil war there, stayed to join the Republican militia, serving in Aragon and at the Tyrol fronts. He was rising to the rank of a second lieutenant, seriously wounded at Tyrol, was forced to flee from Spain in May 1937. In World War II, he was rejected for military service and headed the Indian service of the BBC until 1943. That year, he became the literary editor of the Tribune and wrote countless numbers of newspaper articles and reviews. In his last years, he worked between bouts of hospitalization for tuberculosis, which he died in a London hospital in January 1950. World famous, of course, for Animal Farm 1984, Homage to Catalonia, he wrote many other books. With respect to my thesis, I would put the focus in my short overview, very short, just spotlights on a few of them. Down and Out in Paris and London, 1933, Keeps the Expedistra Flying, 1936, The Road to Wigan Pier, 37, Coming Up for Air, 39, and finally The Lion and the Unicorn in 1941, so 3 fictional and 3 non-fictional. Further on, to understand Orwell's perception of social change in the interwar period, it is necessary to present his concept of the past, which is not classic or traditional, but much more history from the bottom of small people, as we know it from the everyday history movement, and of course the labor history of the 1980s. Maybe in the last 10 years in Germany, the emotion history has also been very successful. That sticks also to it, I suppose. In his novel Coming Up for Air, 39, the protagonist, George Bowling, returns in his imagination to the place where he grew up, Lower Binfield, and describes the past as a curious thing. It's with you all the time. I suppose an hour never passes without you thinking of things that happened 10 or 20 years ago, and yet most of the time it's got no reality. It's just a set of facts that you've learned, like a lot of stuff in a history book. Then some chance sight or sound or smell, especially smell, sets you going, and the past doesn't merely come back to you. You are actually in the past. It was like that at this moment. The potential of the past, I would argue into that direction, develops itself in the confrontation of historical memory, which is stimulated by sounds and smells. As we know, the work of George Orwell is full of references towards flavors, aromas, and smells, which might be seen by some authors in a psychological way, as a traumatic washing compulsion, for example. I will not add any further speculations to that, but I think we can show that smell, taste, discomfort, even hatred and class are directly connected. Chapter 1. To the sad truth, after wars, when masses of soldiers were repatriated in their home countries, most of them had extreme difficulties to return into their former professions and jobs positions, because others, sometimes younger, better educated, more experienced people and even women took over. So that for the war heroes, mass unemployment was an imprinting experience. This did not only refer to the defeated nations as Germany or Austria and Hungary, but also for those victorious ones as France and Britain. In his novel Coming Up for Air, 1939, on the eve of World War II, Orwell is reflecting on that problem after World War I. I quote him, "The war jerked me out of the old life. I'd known, but in the queer period that came afterwards, I forgot it almost completely. It was a queer time, those years after the war, almost queerer than the war itself, though people don't remember it so vividly. In a rather different form, the sense of disbelieving in everything was stronger than ever. Millions of men suddenly being kicked out of the army to find that the country they'd fought for didn't want them, and Lloyd George and his pals were giving the works to any illusions that still existed. Everybody in England seemed to be scrambling for jobs. It was the effect of army life, the effect of wearing pips and having a checkbook and calling the evening meal dinner. All the while there had been an ideal floating around, and this applied to the men in the ranks as well as the officers, that when we came out of the army, there'd be jobs waiting for us that would bring in at least as much as our army pay. Of course, if ideas like that didn't circulate, no war would ever be fought. Every mortal job was filled already, either by men who'd been few years too old to fight, or by boys who'd been a few months too young. The poor bastards who'd happened to be born between 1890 and 1900 were left out at the call." For Orwell, these experiences were the realities of modern life, in which for most people it took the form of selling themselves, that's to say, getting a job and keeping it. Why did Orwell call the principle of people to sell themselves as the realities of modern life? Because he knew personally how devastating hunger, poverty, low-paid work, and unemployment were. He was fully aware of different forms and dimensions of poverty and its consequences, even without knowing the fundamental research of Marie Yehuda, Paul Felix Lazarsfeld, and Hans Seisel, who published the first scientific study about the effects of long-term unemployment in an Austrian village called Marienthal in the same year as Orwell's social report, Down and Out in Paris and London. He was able to feel sympathy with the poor and outlaws of Paris and London and experienced himself poverty. About his first contact with poverty, he wrote in Down and Out in Paris and London the following: It is altogether curious, your first contact with poverty. You have thought so much about poverty. It is the thing you have feared all your life, the thing you knew would happen to you sooner or later, and it is so utterly and prosaically different. You thought it would be quite simple. It is extraordinarily complicated. You thought it would be terrible. It's merely squalid and boring. It's the peculiar lowness of poverty that you discover first, the shift that puts you to the complicated meanness, a crust wiping. According to Orwell, a vicious circus is established. First of all, you have to pretend to all other people that you are living quite as usual. From the beginning, it tangles you in a net of lies, and even with lies, you can hardly manage it. Then even a minor catastrophe robs your foot, and you discover what it is like to be hungry. Further on, you discover the boredom which is inseparably from poverty. The times when you have nothing to do and being underfed can interest yourself in nothing. To sum up, struggling for keeping up appearances, social pretension, social isolation, social apostasy, and no social participation in politics, leisure activities, or communal work, and no option to turn the tide in one's favor. In his report on the underclasses in France, Orwell describes the French luxury hotel as an elaborate caste system in which a strict social order like a pyramid exists where different jobs are distinguished by different sorts of income in form of salary, tips, social connections and benefits via bribery. Further on, the social order is strictly defined by eating habits, professional uniforms, and different lifestyles of the workforce. As a plongeur or dishwasher, Orwell was at the bottom of the hierarchical order, and we were the very dregs of the hotel and bullied by everyone else. But even with work, you are kept in insecurity because low-paid jobs keep you in a permanent rhythm between work and sleep without time to think, hardly conscious of the exterior world. Orwell, as a plongeur in a luxury hotel in Paris, did no longer experience poverty, but his existence was reduced to a daily simple routine, which drinking and sleeping were the substantial pleasures. For him, the plongeur serves as an example of the slaves of the modern world. Quote him again. Not there is any need to whine over him, for he's better off than many manual workers, but still is not freer than if he were bought and sold. His work is servile and without art. He's paid just enough to keep him alive. His only holiday is a sack. He's cut off from marriage, or if he's married, his wife must work. At this moment, there are men with university degrees scrubbing dishes in Paris, maybe in Dublin as well, for 10 or 15 hours a day. Those people have been simply trapped by routine, which makes thought impossible. The remarkable thing here is not just a description of the social circumstances, but also why people are kept in such social conditions. In a summary of the social role of the plongeur, a fundamental criticizes the fears and prejudice of the ruling elites. To sum up, a plongeur is a slave, a wasted slave doing stupid and largely unnecessary work. He's kept at work ultimately because of a vague feeling that he would be dangerous if he had leisure. And educated people should be on his side as squeeze in the process because they know nothing about him and consequently are afraid of him. I say this of the plongeur because it is a case I've been considering. I would equally apply to numberless other types of workers. According to Orwell, fearing the underclass is a result of ignorance, prejudice, and not knowing those people and the social conditions in which they have to live. Fearing social rebellion and upheaval did not take into consideration the long-term consequences of unemployment and precarious living conditions, which do not lead to resistance or a revolution, but usually to passive resignation. That is also a result of the study Marienthal. My core chapter is chapter 3, Class and its Distinctions, a question of money, smell and taste. For Orwell, stepping into the shoes of Karl Marx in 1936, the modern industrial world is ruled by money. In the case of George Comstock, the protagonist in the novel Keeps the Expedistra Flying, who declared his private war on money, ends with a pessimistic view: serve money, God, or go under. There's no other rule. For Orwell's protagonist, our civilization is founded on greed and fear. In his grim vision of London and the Western world, Comstock, evoked by the sounds of London's tube, quote him, "So 1,000 million slaves toiling and groveling about the throne of money. The earth is plucked, ships sail, miners sweat in dripping tunnels, underground. Clerks hurry for the 8:15 with the fear of the boss eating at their vitals. And even in bed with their wives, they tremble and obey. Obey whom? The money priesthood, the pink-faced masters of the world, the upper crust." But in the end, George Comstock came to terms with the capitalistic system due to the pregnancy of his girlfriend. In Orwell's outstanding account of the effect of the world economic crisis in 1929 on the coal mining areas in northern England called The Road to Wigan Pier, Orwell makes once again conscious the social reality of mass unemployment, hopelessness and massive impoverishment. For him, there was no doubt about the devastating effects of unemployment. Unemployment for Orwell is not a self-inflicted social destiny, but a catastrophe concerning health, psychology, and economic well-being, and even for the nutritional and heating situation of the people. Especially in the second part of The Road to Wigan Pier, Orwell gives an illustrative description of the English class system. Nevertheless, I quote him, the essential point about the English class system is that it is not entirely explicable in terms of money. Roughly speaking, it is a money stratification, but it is rather like a jerry-built modern bungalow haunted by medieval ghosts. Economically speaking, you can identify two different classes, the rich and the poor, very classic. But, and this is important, socially there's a whole hierarchy of classes, and the manners and traditions learned by each class in childhood are not only very different, but this is the essential point, generally persist from birth to death. To coin a phrase, class-specific socialization from the cradle to the grave, or in the words of Orwell, it is in fact very difficult to escape culturally from the class in which you have been born. Regarding the differences between classes, Orwell saw strict social barriers, which he compares to the plate glass pane of an aquarium. It is so easy to pretend that it isn't there and so impossible to get through it. Those class differences, quote him, derive from the early training in which a middle-class child is taught almost simultaneously to wash his neck, to be ready to die for his country, and to despise the lower classes. For him, the only way to overcome class differences was starting to understand how one class appears when seen through the eyes of another. Where did this middle-class hatred against the working class came from? Orwell's answer was radical. It is summed up in 4 frightful words, which people nowadays are chary of uttering, but which were bandied about quite freely in my childhood. The lower classes smell, and this is printed in the German and the English copy in cursive letters. Body odor, smell as a social stigma and barrier which provoked in the middle and upper classes physical disgust, which resulted from being brought up to believe that they were dirty. I quote him, very early in life you acquired the idea that there was something subtly repulsive about a working class body. You would not get nearer to it than you could help. Further on, he remarked that the smell of their sweat, the very texture of their skins, were mysteriously different from yours. In this end of this passage, Orwell concludes that those stigmatizing ideas and beliefs were the results of social attributions or ascriptions and do not have to do with the actual odor or smells, but are resulting out of living conditions and physical manual work, which is predominantly done by the working class. Besides that, Orwell is not just talking about body odor, smells, but also about social and cultural taste. He observed also that middle-class people who sympathize with the working class is vastly more at home with a member of his own class. His tastes in food, wine, clothes, books, pictures, music, ballad are still recognizably bourgeois tastes. Most significant of all, he invariably marries into his own class. Nowadays, sociologists would say social reproduction by class-specific marital behavior along cultural patterns of distinction. Orwell was even more precise when he saw the reason for this behavior in an enormous social discomfort. I quote him, "It can only be because in his heart he feels that proletarian manners are disgusting. So you see, he's still responding to the training of his childhood when he was taught to hate, fear, and despise the working class. Here we have something which is in the 70s called habitus development. Finally, he concludes pessimistically, however much you like them, however interesting you find their conversation, there's always that accursed itch of class difference, like the pea under the prince's mattress. It's not a question of dislike or distaste, only of difference, but it is enough to make real intimacy impossible." Chapter 4. For Orwell, the modern industrial world is not only to be seen in a pessimistic, grim, or even nostalgic way. After Britain had entered World War II in 1939, he published in 1941, with a line in the Unicorn, Socialism and the English Genius, an essay that discusses the need for a socialist revolution in England to overcome the class system in order to be victorious over Germany, and even to ascertain that Britishness, or better Englishness, has to survive in times of global war. For Orwell, it is crystal clear. There's no question about the inequality of wealth in England. It is grosser than in any European country, and you have to look down the nearest street to see it. Economically, England is certainly two nations, if not three or four. But apart from that, the line in the unicorn also reflects the upward and downward extension of the middle classes in the last 20 years and the formation of indeterminate social classes in an advanced capitalism. In Orwell's view, this destroyed almost absolutely the old classification of society into capitalists, proletarians, and petit bourgeois, or small property owners. Orwell portrays the new class structure as falling. England is a country in which property and financial power are concentrated in a very few hands. Few people in modern England own anything at all, except clothes, furniture, possibly a house. The peasantry have long since disappeared. The independent shopkeeper is being destroyed. The small businessman is diminishing in numbers. But at the same time, modern industry is so complicated that it cannot get along with great numbers of managers, salesmen, engineers, chemists, technicians of all kinds, drawing fairly large salaries. And these in turn call into being a professional class of doctors, lawyers, teachers, artists. The tendency of advanced capitalism, therefore, has been to enlarge the middle class and not to wipe it out, as it once seemed likely to do. Besides that, he states as a new trend the spread of middle-class ideas and habits among the working class. Moreover, the British working classes are now better off in almost all ways than they were 30 years ago. This goes partly back to the successful efforts of the trade unions, but also, according to Orwell, to the mere advance of physical science. However unjustly society is organized, certain technical advances are bound to benefit the whole community because certain goods are necessarily held in common. Nearly all citizens of civilized countries now enjoy the use of good roads, germ-free water, police protection, free libraries, and probably free education of a kind. To an increasing extent, the rich and the poor read the same books. They also see the same films, as listen to the same radio program. And the differences in their way of life have been diminished by the mass production of cheap clothes and improvements in housing. So far as outward appearance goes, the clothes of rich and poor, especially in the case of the women, differ far less than they did 30 years ago. As to housing, England still has slums which are blood on civilization, but much building has been done during the past 10 years, largely by the local authorities. I have here a picture showing that, and Orwell his comment on it is a person who has grown up in a council housing estate is likely to be indeed visibly is more middle class in outlook than a person who has grown up in a slum. And here we have a slums in northern England in 1936 and council houses. This is even affecting society as a whole because new industrial methods, by shifting from hard to less physical work as in the new light or service industry, have led to a general softening of the matter. Many workers in the light industries are less truly manual laborers than is a doctor or grocer. In tastes, habits, manners, and outlook, the working class and the middle class are drawing together. The unjust distinctions remain, but the real differences diminish. The old-style proletarian, colorless, unshaven, and with muscles warped by heavy labor still exists, but is constantly decreasing in numbers. He only predominates in the heavy industry areas of the north of England. Before World War I, every human being could be placed within society. We heard about this by his clothes, his manners, and the accent, but this changed at the end of the 1930s, according to Orwell, completely. These are the results of tremendous changes, which include the southward shift of industry, new patterns of living, and a wide gradation of income. But for Orwell, it is the same kind of life that is being lived at different levels in labor-saving flats or council houses. To that civilization belong the people who are most at home and most definitely of the modern world, the technicians and the higher paid skilled workers, the airmen and the mechanics, the radio experts, film producers, popular journalists, and industrial chemists. They are at the indeterminate stratum at which the older class distinctions are beginning to break down. Finally, Orwell concluded, this war, unless we are defeated, will wipe out most of the existing class privileges. Chapter 5. All in all, Orwell was too optimistic concerning the wiping out of existing class privileges, but definitely in his social analysis he was going far beyond Marxist approaches on class structure, foreshadowing the agenda of the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu since the late 1970s, known as habitus development. He's offering a fresh view on English society in the interwar period. Orwell modified the established apparatus in which different types of income, capital, menace, taste, up and downward mobility, social discomfort, and class hatred were integrated. One can say that all those ideas were present and accessible in the interwar period. Of course, there's no concise new theory, but many elements of it. Interestingly enough, those ideas were forgotten after World War II. I suppose this has to do with the overall denial of Marxist ideas in the Cold War, the long-term consequences of anti-communist policies in Europe and the United States. If we turn our eyes back to the future, then it becomes clearer.
I'm very sorry, Dr. Buehlbaecher, we're really up against it here.
Oh, sorry. Just finishing. That the great epoch of social analysis were not only the late 1960s, but also the late 1920s and 30s. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Oisin, we got. Just I know everybody's been here for the last couple of days. I'm sure they're tired, and Sunday is not maybe the best day to be giving a talk. And after you're just looking forward to go home and getting your head showered. So, first of all, thanks for the invitation to speak here today. It's an interesting topic. Clearly, it's an important topic. The future of socialism is not an abstract or an academic question, as the title of this session might suggest. Whether considered as a coherent political ideology or as a social and economic system based on social ownership of property, its future is entirely dependent upon the actions of real people in the material world, on the ideological struggle for ideas and the class struggle for human emancipation. While there are many varieties of Marxism, the core tenets of Marx's thinking are readily stated. Above all else, Marxism is a theory of human action. Human action creates the relationships between people, creates human society, and brings about social change, also known as history. Marx regarded work, in the broadest sense, as the key human action. Work is the creative human activity that lies at the heart of everything else in society: culture, politics, law, knowledge, education. Marxism is rooted in materialism. For Marx, everything exists in relationships. Everything is connected to the material world in which it exists, and nothing floats free of this connectedness. The structures in society and economy are actually sets of human relationships. It is impossible to identify the structures of society or the economy outside the human relations between people that define them. Class is central to Marxist thinking. Class is derived from our relationship to the means of production. Those who own property are the dominant and ruling class in society. Those who don't own property and are forced to sell their labour to those who do are the workers, working class. This is crucial, in the first place because the working class is forced to sell its labour in the marketplace. Workers no longer control or own their labour, the central creative action of their lives, and are alienated from both their work and the product of their work. They are subject to the decisions, goals, and intentions of the owners of property, the ruling class. Instead of forming free and fully human relations with each other, we meet each other in the marketplace. Our relationships are distorted and are transactional. Secondly, because humans beings come together in the first instance to produce the means of their existence, class is at the heart of everything in a society based upon private ownership of property. Who owns property determines what is produced and how, and what the relationship productions are. Human societies grow and develop from the first coming together, creating politics, law, culture, knowledge, and everything else in society. And from the beginning, each of these is imbued with the practice and ideology of private ownership, of class. The state, as we understand it, emerges because of the conflicting class interests in society and ensures and promotes the interests and ideas of the property owners, the ruling class. When considering the material advances of the working class in times in the states dominated by social democracy, we should bear in mind, welcome the real as many of these gains are, but do they undermine or challenge private property, or do they consolidate the class system? Imperialism, sometimes referred to as monopoly capitalism, is the structural expression of class and private ownership of property in the contemporary world. It arises from the consolidation of productive and financial capital into bigger and fewer corporations, and subsequent superseding the productive capacity of finance capital, which becomes dominant in the imperialist system. The export of financial capital exceeds the export of goods, and the global division of labour becomes restructured. Alongside these economic changes, a new political division of the world into spheres of influence and interest develops. This is decisively different to the old colonial order, and indeed colonies have largely disappeared from the imperialist world, probably not the 6 counties and places like and the such like. As I pointed out at the beginning, the future of socialism is not an abstract question. Armed with an understanding of the basic ideas of Marxism, we can begin to look at our world as we find it today and how we can change it. The backdrop to our discussion today is complex but not impossible to unravel and to understand, thereby allowing us to develop strategies for a way forward. Much of the debate on the left, and particularly in the academic circles over the last few decades, has been narrowly focused on the defeat of socialism, in particular the overthrow of workers' power in the Soviet Union. Some on the left, and liberals and social democrats, welcome this defeat, believing that it would lead to a flowering of real socialism. The victory of those counter-revolutionary forces led to the emergence of a unipolar world dominated by imperialism, particularly the US. It also led to more intensified attacks upon the social advances made by the working class globally, and particularly in the developed capitalist countries, on the route of social democracy, particularly here in Europe, as it adopted and championed the economic, political and social priorities of the ruling class in the form of neoliberalism, policies that were and are required by the system to save the system. In the developed capitalist countries, we have witnessed limited resistance to the wars, in both large and small, around the globe, orchestrated by imperialism, and in particular the United States and NATO, to ensure the continued domination of global finance capital and the imposition of policies conducive to the interests of finance capital globally, and to reassert US and Western leadership and hegemony. The current proxy war in Ukraine is a prelude to a possible war with China, a war that could well escalate into a nuclear configuration. Such policies are imposed by soft power through culture and trade, for example, through supranational body institutions that exercise both soft and hard power, such as the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the International Criminal Court, the European Union, enabling super-exploitation and domination. Where these policies are challenged, force is applied to ensure compliance with imperialism's rule-based order. The global architecture of imperialism, the Quads and the AUKUS, hard power, have been created to encircle China and to initiate another war, which will be a disaster for the working class all over the world. The growing military structures of the European Union add to this increasing militarism and aggression. Certainly here in Ireland, significant sections of the left, social democracy and left liberals have failed to address the role of imperialism in our own country over the course of the 20th century and into the 21st century, in particular with the events taking place in the 6 counties over 40 years. They failed to seriously understand, never mind challenge, Ireland's relationship with imperialism, how that relationship has changed and is changing, how the strategy of imperialism is to make sure there is no future for socialism, what the Irish communists describe as the triple lock of imperialism. I believe there are 3 essential questions that the left must address and come to grips with. that all politics are about class, that different classes and class interests exist and compete. I recall here that class issues concern the private ownership of property, and the class struggle revolves around this. That the state is not neutral, but is the means by which the dominant class controls and organises society economically, culturally, socially, and with legal structures to ensure best conditions for the protection of capital, of the capitalist mode of production, and the reproduction of capital. That imperialism exists, that is the highest and most developed stage of capitalism, where finance capital is a decisive feature, and which is also a stage of its decay. All things in a class society are influenced and shaped by the dominant class. Under capitalism, the state is the main vehicle to securing the needs of capital, for sustaining the exploitation of workers, and for the creation of the best conditions for securing the capitalist mode of production, a system of exploitation. This is the only basis on which we can understand class, that the state and society are structured by capitalism, and that is how it develops to meet its needs, that is, the reproduction of capital. The nature of bourgeois ideology and how it shapes people's worldview tends to encourage the middle strata of society into alliances with the ruling class. This is even more so when we have a weak and underdeveloped working class consciousness. A radicalized working class, as shown, can attract sections of the middle strata to a more radical transformative society. The state is not neutral. It is not above classes or a neutral arbitrator between contesting class interests. Instead, it is essential for securing the interests of capital. Its various institutions are designed and hotwired to ensure the continuation of capitalist mode of production. There is no equality of ideas, no free flow of ideas, such as an alternative worldview within the myriad of state and ideological generating institutions. The state is the crucial instrument for the expression of class power. While there is great flexibility regarding how bourgeois power can be made more acceptable and camouflaged, its essential role is coercion in ideological, economic, cultural, social, and political conformity. But it also conducts ideological struggle through culture, education, law, and all facets of society to encourage consensus, compliance, and submission. Within this conformity, there is some flexibility. It is a room with many mirrors, but no windows. No view of any possible alternative worldview. Simply put, the state makes the capitalist mode of production to be simply the most common sense way to organize human relations. The CPI believes it is essential for any progress to be made that we have clarity and understanding regarding the nature and role of imperialism in Ireland, or, to put it another way, to just understand that imperialism actually exists. Imperialism is the highest development of capitalism, emerging at the end of the 19th century, when both productive and finance capital had consolidated into bigger and fewer corporations, and finance capital had taken control over large-scale industry and had come to dominate state policy in most powerful countries. That deepening control is reflected in the growth of financialization today. Finance is the dominant and controlling power in economics and politics. The clearest example of this dominance is the continued refusal of the rich imperialist states to take significant action to prevent the destruction of the environment. Profit for the financial elite is overwhelmingly motive, and nothing is allowed to stand in its way. At the national level, 32 counties, when I talk about national, I talk about Ireland nationally, not the Free State or the 26 counties of the Republic. We are experiencing the grip of finance capital on the provisions of shelter. On the non-economic superstructure that grows up on the basis of the needs of finance capital, its politics and ideology propels the drive for spheres of influence and the drawing more countries and territories into the grip of the big powers. This is true in Ireland as much as anywhere else, within the state's own reliance upon foreign direct investment and the creaming off of imperial rent from the transnational capital. As events are now unfolding show, the growth and influence of China as a challenge to global imperial economic domination and hegemony, and as possible alternative source of capital and capital investment and social development, is creating conditions whereby once again the question of national sovereignty, of economic and political and cultural domination is becoming a critical one throughout the global south, reflected in the emergence of a bloc of countries gravitating around BRICS and the changed nature of these states' relationships with the dominant imperialist blocs. Monopoly finance capital does not want liberty, it wants domination. It needs subordination and compliance. It is opposed to national sovereignty, democracy and independence. This is one of the driving forces propelling new forms of resistance reflected in the current struggles in Africa and Latin America, which takes on a progressive character, reflective of the historical experience and of the oppressed nations and peoples for over decades of colonialism and neo-colonialism, and the arbitrary power of the imperialist bloc and its arbitrary international rules-based order. That is to impose and accept the capitalist mode of production and the imperialist domination. Discontent among the population with economic and social and political failures and shortcomings, internal rivalries with the elites. The legacy of colonial manipulation, interference, and local factors also play a big part. National sovereignty and independence are emerging with renewed vigour in the demands for securing national democracy and sovereignty, for breaking the subservience to the needs of imperialism as well as the needs of the people, against the needs of the people. So it is important that we understand what is happening in Asia, what is happening in Africa and in Latin America, that we look towards more progressive developments as a thing of the present and the future. It is clear then that the national struggles occurring there are necessarily a part of the class struggle and the struggle against imperialism. Here in Ireland, north and south, we can see how imperialism has shaped and is shaping the material conditions in conjunction with the needs of the comprador bourgeois class and liberal intelligentsia. The Good Friday Agreement is a product of the needs and interests of the imperialist triple lock on the people of Ireland. Forces once clearly outside the establishment framework are now well within the existing current economic and political structures. We need to develop and build national struggles that both advance the material interests of the working class and at the same time raise the level of political consciousness. Struggle is where our class grows in understanding that is the system that is the cause of economic and social questions. The struggle is interconnected to the struggle for national sovereignty and national democracy. Among the biggest weaknesses in the labour movement are the very low levels of ideological and political understanding of the decline of trade union membership, activity and influence. Social welfare benefits and services exist because of two factors in the 20th century: the trade union movement and the fear of spread of socialist ideology and activities in the shadow of the strong Soviet Union and the rise of Eastern European socialist states. The counter-revolution in Eastern Europe lifted pressure off the capitalist states and their rulers. So too did the change in the nature of the major sections of the trade unions, typified by national agreements and constant barrage of propaganda presenting workers, employers and the state as partners. A further dilution of the trade union activity came as more and more workers are employed by large corporations, which bring with them anti-union procedures, deals with workers as individuals. For the Irish left to advance, to challenge the dominant economic and political narrative, to challenge imperialism, and increasingly to challenge the rise of the right-wing forces, the foot soldiers of finance capital, it needs to start talking to the working class and not at it. We cannot allow the right to confuse and divide the working class with its false championing of the struggle for national democracy and sovereignty. Radical change is only brought about by a radicalised working class, confident in its political demands and clear in where it needs to go to secure its material interests. Our class needs to be radicalised to bring about a rupture in the existing economic and political social order. This necessary rupture with the barbarism of capitalism is absolutely required in order to build a more civilised society to allow us to be fully human. That is socialism. It is increasingly clear that if we are to save our planet from destruction, then we have to break with the economic system of capitalism to establish an economic and social system that can work in harmony with nature. Socialism is the only system that can save and restore the planet. Here in Ireland, it is back to Connolly and seeing the complex and dialectical relationship between the national liberation and socialism. We need to stop paying lip service to the legacy of Connolly. We need to promote his ideas among the working class, to build class awareness and class politics into our everyday struggles. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Eugene, and thanks to all of our speakers. I think we do have just 5 minutes possibly before lunch is served, so if we have one or two very quick questions, we have the roving mic. I can see, I think, is that Mike at the back? Is it, whoever has their hand up there.
Thank you very much. The name is Donald Denham, redundant at 65 years of age. Thank you all for your contributions, thought-provoking as they were. I want to hone in on what Helena said in a most impressive contribution and well delivered, Helena. If I may pay you a compliment, one of my heroes, Countess Markowitz, I imagine would have spoken in similar terms had she the opportunity to do so today. Unfortunately, though, the reality is that our own 1916 rebellion led very quickly to the reality, as Eugene has described, we have to deal in reality, the reality of a parliamentary democracy. And that parliamentary democracy has since rapidly deteriorated into receiving instructions from unelected commissioners of the European Union in Brussels. Here, closer to home, ministers who once accepted from the likes of myself unelected civil servants and who now only listen to the media-driven contributions of their special advisors.
We are quite tight for time.
And my question to you, Helena, is, isn't it time to update Marxism? Isn't it time to find a new system to govern ourselves?
Thank you.
Is this working? Yeah. Marxism updates itself all the time. It's been around for a long time, and at no point has it ever been static. Marxism is constantly feeling the pulse of the times and trying to figure out a way forward. I mean, we know that Marx and Engels addressed a world very different from ours. They addressed the role of the working class in terms of the heyday of industrial capitalism. Whereas we live in a world where the system is dominated by finance capitalism, which even parasites on industrial capitalism as well as on the labor of the working class. I mean, the whole world we face is full of challenges, and not least the ecological. And there's a big debate among Marxists about degrowth. I mean, anything that is cutting edge in our times, Marxists are dealing with it. I mean, you mentioned parliamentary democracy. I mean, this is a long-standing debate on the left and even among Marxists. The whole debate about, well, actually a lot of you have gray hair, and like you probably remember the debate about the British road to socialism. But like what is the role of parliamentary democracy? I believe that socialism is something to be built on the other side of capitalism, something that takes all the advances that capitalism has brought in this stage of history, that is industrial productivity, and parliamentary democracy. I mean, we need a state. We need an organized way of expressing our collective will and our collective interests. Now, the state, as we know it, is not a very satisfactory tool, but I think that we need to make the demand, the state is ours, the state is us, and we need to call out the parties that claim to represent us, that claim to represent the working class, and don't, that express the interests of an international oligarchy and not the interests of the working class, either here or somewhere else. So I think a starting point about that is to be clear about the nature of class and what we're demanding, not only of particular employers, but of the state as a class. But Marxism is not something on a shelf on mothballs.
Hey, Thank you very much for the Sheehan. I'm afraid I think they are very eager to serve lunch out in the foyer, so I think... Sorry.
Just a very brief point in question. Bernd, Buehlbaecher, I thought you were a really interesting paper, and of course what you reminded of us was that in the history of European socialist thought there's a great deal of thinking about class and its complexities. But the question I wanted to ask was both to Helena Sheehan and to Eugene McCartan. I mean, Eugene, you said rightly that the future of socialism isn't an abstract thing, but neither is the past of socialism. And so I just wanted to ask both of you how you apply your analysis of class to two systems, Soviet Russia and Communist China, which precisely bypassed parliamentary democracy and which resulted in failed economic systems and political tyrannies, which in both cases were responsible for the deaths of tens of millions of people. And not in a programmatic way, but in a kind of introspective way. I'd be interested to have your thoughts on that.
Should I go first, or you, Eugene? Basically, I have a very critical approach to both the Soviet Union and to China, but I believe there is more to defend than to denounce. I think we have to see socialism as not some abstract platonic form. I think we have to see these as experiments that our species has undertaken. They're experiments in socialism. They achieve socialism in certain respects, but not in others. I've written about this a lot and the whole history of it and Stalin and the purges and everything. Obviously, Jack McGinley is very uptight about finishing in time for lunch, and I can't go on, and Eugene still has to answer this. So I'm not going to, basically I want to say there's more to defend than to denounce in the history of the Soviet Union. There is almost nothing negative you can tell me about the Soviet Union that I don't know when I'm saying that. I've been there, I've studied it, I've written about it, I've thought very seriously about it. Now China, I tell you, there is nobody in the world, probably nobody in the history of the world who has studied, nobody studies the Soviet Union as seriously as China. Everything about the history of the Soviet Union, and especially how it ended. I think China, I'm really focusing a lot now on China. I'm trying to understand China. I'm going there in the next year, speaking at the World Congress of Marxism. I want to learn everything I can before I go, and learn everything I can while I'm there, and write about it when I come back. I think it is some great, they've taken the idea that the Soviet Union had during the new economic policy about allowing a certain scope for in the Soviet Union, it was small traders. China believes it can use capitalism to build socialism. I think this is a very dangerous experiment, but it's, I'm open to, develop a more fine-grained analysis of it than what I have. But the state is in control. The Communist Party is in control. You say it's not very democratic. Well, there are many, the Soviet Union and China have other forms of democracy. Their workplaces, their local areas. Again, I'm talking to, there's so much to say and so little time to say it. I'll move up to Eugene.
Thanks very much, Professor. Now, that was a very broad question, but Eugene, maybe for the very quick comment before the soup gets cold.
Yep.
Thanks.
The point, I guess, it's socialism was a product of the material world with all the complications. People do not walk into the future shed of all the past. They walk into the future with the baggage of the past, or the cultural and socioeconomic backwardness that capitalism or feudalism, whatever else, imposed upon them. So they bring with them into the future a lot of the ideas and cultural values of the past. So the struggle for socialism is about also the struggle to develop a new culture, develop a new basis on which human beings can come together. So if we're dealing with politics in terms of moral things, if it's morally wrong to kill people, and therefore the Soviet Union killed so many people, and the Chinese killed so many people on the construction of socialism. So we apply this moral yardstick, as you do, as a moral yardstick, because you dismiss socialism because it killed people. Then how do we value capitalism? How do we value capitalism? We have had 2 world wars in the first 20th century. How many millions were killed there? How many millions died under the whip of colonialism? How many died under the whip of colonialism? How many died of the famines? Famines are only political because they happened in the Soviet Union or they happened in China. So all the other famines are not political. Are they not political? If they are political, then how many people died of famines constructed, as we know in Ireland? The Gortamore, the Great Hunger, wasn't a famine. It was deliberate starvation by the colonial rulers. So how do we equate all this? Socialism is about where the balance of forces lie at a particular moment in time. You never had the full flowering of socialism. You never could and you never will. Because the dominant feature of the 20th century and the 21st century is imperialism. It dominates and shapes our world. Therefore, other developments are, to a degree, shaped by that as well. And we look around. Imperialism does not have a problem. The United States, the European Union, does not have a problem with crushing Cuba, causing them no oil to get there, no medical supplies, no problem whatsoever. They have no problem crucifying Venezuela. They have no problem crucifying Nicaragua. Where are all the liberals bullshitting about this? Tell me, where are they? Where are they? No, but they can tell you every little creep that happened in the Soviet Union. They can tell everything about China, but they know damn all about their own country. They know damn all what imperialism is doing in the world today.
I think that's okay, Eugene. Thank you very much. And thanks to all of our speakers. I'd like everyone to express their appreciation for these 3 wonderful speakers who actually was very interesting. So lunch is being served directly across as you go out. Just to remind you, we're being asked again for health and safety reasons, please form 1 queue, get your soup and your lunch, and then go proceed straightly into the Connolly room with the Cushliff bar to eat. And again, please don't form 2 queues. They're very adamant about that. Thank you very much, everyone.